Miriam Keppler. I'd like to welcome Miriam Keppler, not just for giving a seminar today, but also she just moved here to Tucson from Heidelberg, and so she's going to find a very different climate, particularly as we get to summer than what you may be used to over there. Heidelberg is a beautiful city. And so Miriam, tell us about what you're up to and your work over in Germany and whatever.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much. So first of all, I would really like to thank you a lot for the opportunity to present my work today at the Planetary Science Institute. Yeah, so indeed, I did my PhD at the Max Planck Institute for Astronomy, and I have been there a postdoc now since the end of last year, until the end of last year, and I just moved to Tucson a few weeks ago, and I'm very, very happy to be here. So I'm currently exploring opportunities for collaborations and possible projects. So yeah, I'm really happy that I can talk to you today. My thesis was on the topic on observational perspectives of giant planet formation. And yeah, I would like to highlight that there are actually many collaborators and colleagues that have contributed to this work. So I'm just listing a few of them here at the bottom of the slide, but there have been actually much more collaborators that have been involved into these projects, and to which I'm very grateful for that. And so I will just start my presentation here, if that's okay. So yeah, just a brief overview of what I'm going to show you in the next about 45 minutes. So I first will provide you with some context and motivation on planet formation. I will then present you the discovery of PDS-70b and show you a few examples of how we can use this system to probe different aspects of planet formation from the observational point of view. And then I will close my talk with a few conclusions. So yeah, so far more than 4,000 exoplanets have been discovered, showing us a very large diversity in terms of their properties. So here you see this famous planet mass with a semi-major axis plot for the detected exoplanets. And yeah, it is clear that in particular in comparison to our own solar system, these exoplanets actually cover a very broad range of properties. So there are planets that are as massive as Jupiter or much more massive, that are found in orbits of tens or hundreds of AU to their host star, or they can also be found extremely close to their star, such as hot Jupiters. And then we also have, for example, another population of planets that have been detected that are in mass somewhere between Earth and Neptune, and which is a planet class that is not represented within our solar system. So this diversity does not only concern the individual properties of the planets themselves, but also the system architectures. So on the one hand, we have systems like HR 8799, where we have multiple giant planets on all orbits of tens of AU from the host star. And then we have detected systems such as TRAPPIST-1, where we have a couple of rocky planets on extremely tightly packed orbits, all smaller than the orbit of Mercury. So that means that in order to explain this diversity, we really have to understand which of these properties are actually set by the initial conditions of their birth environments and by their formation process, and which of them evolve during their evolution through various dynamical interactions. And for this, so we really have to understand how planets actually form and what the initial characteristics of their birth environments are. So yeah, planets are a byproduct of star formation. And at some point when these molecular clouds have collapsed to form protostars, those will be surrounded by protoplanetary disks, which are the birthplaces of planets. And these protoplanetary disks are usually observed to survive only within the first 10 million years of a stellar life. after which they usually quickly disperse. So that means that planets have a very restricted time scale to condense out of these disks. So protoplanetary disks are composed to 99% of gas and 1% of dust. So here you see a scattered light image of such a protoplanetary disk. And what is happening in the very, very general picture is that these initially very small dust grains in these disks, they will, through one process or another, be able to grow over many orders of magnitudes until such a planetary embryo might then be sufficiently massive to actually accrete a very large amount of gas from the surrounding disk and therefore transform into a gas giant planet. So this is the very basic picture. However, there are many processes that are involved here that are not yet fully understood, and there are many questions that are still open regarding these processes. So there have been a lot of efforts from the theoretical side to explain these processes and to model them. However, there's still quite few constraints from observations. And it is clear that really to constrain these processes and to validate them, the models, it is very important to also have constraints from observations. And the question now is, can we get such constraints from the observational point of view for these planet formation processes? So one thing that we can do in order to do that is, first of all, observe these protoplanetary disks themselves. How can we do that? So the bulk component within these disks is composed of gas in the form of molecular hydrogen, which is, however, very difficult to observe at the given conditions. And therefore, we would usually observe some molecular traces. For example, carbon monoxide is a very important molecular transition in this, has a very prominent molecular transition in the submillimeter regime that we can observe to trace the gas component in this disk. And CO is a molecule which actually is quite abundant, and therefore it becomes optically thick fairly quickly, such that its emission usually traces the upper layers of these protoplanetary disks. Then we also have this dust component. So on the one hand, we have very small micrometer-sized dust grains, which are typically very well coupled to the gas, so they are lifted into the upper layers of these protoplanetary disks, where they are directly illuminated by the star, and therefore we can probe their presence through near-infrared observations and scattered light. Once these grains grow to large sizes, they might settle down into the very cold midplane of these disks, where we can trace their thermal emission through submillimeter continuum observations. So now that we know how to observe these disks, let's try to bring that into the context to planets. So theory predicts that if you put a giant planet within the gas distribution of a disk, it will interact with the disk, it will exchange angular momentum, and therefore open a gap in the disk if the planet is very massive. And this perturbation of the gas surface density will come along with a perturbation as well of the pressure profile. So large dust grains which are drifting inwards from the outer regions of the disk, they will now be very sensitive to this modified pressure profile, and they will start to accumulate at the location of the pressure peak, which will form out at the outer edge of the gap. So we expect that the spatial distribution of the large grains will form a ring-like structure just at the outer edge of the gap. However, small dust grains, which are very well coupled to the gas, they're usually not that sensitive to this modified pressure gradient, and therefore they will still be able to enter into the disk. And for this reason, we expect, as a consequence of planet-disk interactions, that the spatial distribution of large and small dust grains will be very different. So this phenomenon is called dust filtration. So observations have shown that quite some protoplanetary disks actually show a very peculiar shape of their spectral energy distribution. Namely, some of them show a dip in the mid-infrared at mid-infrared wavelengths. And this is indicative for the fact that their inner regions might actually be depleted from warm dust grains. And this can be confirmed by high resolution observations of these disks, that indeed quite some of them show depleted inner regions, such as this example. And very interestingly, if this same disk is observed at other wavelengths, for example, at near-infrared wavelengths, which trace the small dust grains, this depleted area in the inner region is actually smaller. And this is exactly what we expected above from the process of dust filtration as a consequence of planet-disk interactions. So this is just to highlight that multi-wavelength observations are a very powerful tool to probe these processes. Yeah, thanks to the very high capabilities of current instrumental techniques, it has become possible to really observe quite some of these protoplanetary disks at very high angular resolution. So here you see a gallery of some of these disks observed with ALMA. And you can see that actually, indeed, quite some of them show a lot of substructures, such as gaps and rings or spirals. And this is actually also the case if we even look at near-infrared wavelengths. So here you see a gallery taken with a sphere instrument, where we also see a large amount of substructures. And that means that the question is now, are actually some of these disks indirect signposts of planet formation through these substructures? And to answer this, we really want to search for the direct imprint, so the direct signal of planets within these disks, and to search for forming planets. Yeah, so the first object that I was working on during my PhD was PDS-70. So this is a young star with an age of about 5 million years that was known to host a gas-rich protoplanetary disk that was also known to have a large gap structure in its inner region. And as a first step of our analysis, we really wanted to study this protoplanetary disk, in particular the dust distribution at high detail. So we obtained new observations of the system in near-infrared scattered polarized light. So why polarized light? Well, the thing is that at near-infrared wavelengths, any contribution from the scattered light from the dust will be orders of magnitudes lower than any contribution from the star. So the star completely overwhelms the disk emission, and therefore we have to come with an elaborate technique to actually subtract the contribution from the star. And for this, we can make use of the fact that the intrinsic light from the star will be unpolarized. So here you can see a sketch with the star here in the center, surrounded by the protoplanetary disk. We are viewing the system now from face on, from above. And once the stellar light illuminates the dust in the surrounding disk, the light which is scattered towards the observer will be linearly polarized in this azimuthal pattern. And if we are now able to record the Stokes Q and U components, it will be possible to generate an image in polarized intensity, which now will contain as positive signals all the light which is linearly polarized, which is therefore associated to the scattered light from the disk, while all the light from the star, which is unpolarized, will be filtered out. And it has turned out that this is actually a very efficient technique to image dust and protoplanetary disks at near-infrared wavelengths. So this is how the disk now looks like in polarized light. So here in the center would be the star. We have this kind of bright emission from the outer disk. And we also have like this very large gap, which has already been suspected to be potentially due to forming planets within the disk. So we really wanted now to search for these potential planets. However, we don't expect these planets to be polarized, so we wouldn't see it on this image. And we have to use another method to search for these planets. So as you know, there are many different techniques to search for planets, such as transit photometry or radial velocity. However, they are all very challenging when it comes to search, to approach these very young systems. And this is because young stars are very active and they may just pollute any potential signal from the planet. However, when we use the technique of direct imaging, we can actually benefit from the use of planetary systems because these planets are still very hot from their formation process. So they are expected to radiate very efficiently at near-infrared wavelengths. So what we want to do actually is just to try to make an image of the intrinsic emission of the planet right next to the star. So this might sound very straightforward, however, it is connected to quite some challenges. So first of all, the star and the planet are seen from Earth at a very, very small angular separation. So we have to use observations at very high angular resolution to be able to actually resolve the planet, the distance of the planet and the star. Then, although we expect the planet to radiate efficiently at near-infrared wavelengths, the contribution from the star will always be orders of magnitudes brighter, so we also have to overcome this very high contrast. And then for these very, very young systems that are younger than 10 million years, we also have this disk emission, which also radiates at near-infrared wavelengths, mostly through the scattered light from the dust, which we also somehow have to take into account. So during my PhD, I was part of the scientific consortium of the SPHERE instrument, which is a near-infrared exoplanet imaging instrument dedicated to search for exoplanets and protoplanetary disks. So this is really able to do observations at very high angular resolution and high contrast observations. And in addition to using this very, very specialized and advanced instrument techniques, another step which is very important when searching for these planets is the post-processing of the data, which is mainly for the cause to subtract the contribution from the star. And the method that we are using in this context is angular differential imaging. So in this method, we are operating the telescope in pupil tracking mode. That means that the orientation of the telescope is kept fixed during the observations while the field of view will rotate apparently. So imagine here the star, then there's the planet and the disk surrounding it. And during the observation segments, which usually takes about 2 hours, the orientation of the stellar pattern will kept fixed while everything else will apparently rotate around it. And what we are doing then in the end is that we take the data cube, we compute the median of it, which will now contain all the contribution from the star because it hasn't moved during the observing time. We subtract that from the frames, and then we can derotate all the individual frames to account for the field of view rotation. And in this way, we will then generate a final image which will, in the ideal case, not have any contribution from the star anymore, but where we only are left with the signal from the planet and the disk. So this has shown to work very efficiently to detect point-like sources such as planets. However, it is still a bit challenging in the presence of extended structures such as protoplanetary disks, for the reason that this post-processing might actually distort the shape of any extended structure, and which could create artificial point-like structures which might be misinterpreted as planets. And this is actually the reason why searching for these planets within their disks is very challenging, and why also at the beginning of my thesis only a handful of candidates of protoplanets within their disks had been reported in the literature, which actually still need confirmation. So we observed now PDA-70 using this angular differential imaging method with sphere, and we could actually show the presence of a point-like source here, quite close to the star, to a separation of about 200 milliarc seconds. And in addition, we had a large amount of archival data, all taken with different instruments at different wavelengths, and taken at different epochs. And we could show that this source reappeared in all of these observations very consistently. So we could already exclude that it was actually an instrumental artifact. So now in order to characterize this signal and to investigate what it actually was, we first of all analyzed its astrometry in order to check if it was actually a background star. So here you see the astrometric data points, so the relative positions of the source with respect to the star, PDA-70, for all the different epochs. And since we very well know the distance and the proper motion of the star, we can compute how this relative position should have evolved at the different epochs if it was actually a background star, which has negligible proper motion. And so this is indicated here by these red points. And you can see that the expected positions, if it was a background star, very much differ from that what we actually detected. So we can conclude that the object is actually co-moving with the star. And we could also show that this scatter of the measured relative positions was actually compatible with orbital motion around the star. So from this, we could conclude that it was actually a companion. So now to better understand the nature of the companion, in particular to put first constraints on the mass of the companion, we compared the photometry of the source taken at different wavelengths with the predictions from exoplanet evolutionary tracks, which predict the post-formation luminosity of planets as function of time and mass, assuming different efficiencies for accretional heating during the formation process. So this is what you here see here with the different colors. So they mainly differ in the amount of energy which is either radiated away or incorporated into the planets during the formation process. And from this analysis, we could conclude that in any case, the source was of very low mass, and in particular within the planetary mass regime. So this means that this planet was now really the first planetary mass object, which was clearly detected within the gap of its parental disk, where it was actually forming. So after the discovery of this planet, PDA-70b, the system was actually reobserved at H-alpha wavelengths. So this you can see here on the left plot. And these H-alpha observations could, first of all, confirm the presence of PDA-70b, showing that this was actually still accreting and confirming that it was still at the stage of the formation. But these observations also showed a second source, a second planet in the system, here PDA-70c, which is also a planetary mass object, and which we could then later reconfirm in the near-infrared observations. So this really means that PDA-70 is a planetary system hosting two giant planets, which are both still at the stage of formation, in which are both on the Jupiter or super-Jupiter mass regime. And they are found on orbits of about 21 and 34 AU, which is roughly comparable to the Uranus-Neptune pair. So That means that this system is really an excellent test bed where we can now probe various different processes related to planet formation from an observational point of view. And in the next few slides, I will show you a few examples of what we could do with using follow-up observations on this system. So first of all, I would like to touch the topic of atmospheric properties. So right at the after the discovery of PD70b, we also obtained the first spectrum of the planet, which you can see here with the orange colors. And combining this spectrum with the infrared photometry, we could compare this near-infrared spectral energy distribution now to a set of planetary atmospheric models. So those mainly differed in terms of the composition and treatment of clouds. And with this analysis, we could, first of all, put some first constraints on the planetary properties. But we could also see that actually the only models that did not well reproduce the spectral energy distribution were those that did not contain any clouds. So from this, we can conclude that most likely the atmosphere does contain clouds or dust within the atmosphere. As a next topic, we were looking at the planet-disk interactions. So for this, we run hydrodynamical simulations, putting the two planets in the gas distribution of the disk and let it evolve. And what we could see was not only that the two giant planets were indeed able to carve a very deep gap in the disk, but also that the two planets settled in mean-motion resonance quite early and also migrated outwards, which is similar to the Jupiter-Saturn pair in the solar system. We also included dust grains in these simulations. So with this yellow color, you can see the distribution of the large dust grains, which indeed start to accumulate at the outer edge of the disk, where the pressure maximum is located, as predicted from also previous models. So here you can also see that a radial cut of the dust surface density for these large grains, and you can see that they are indeed very well confined. And we can also see that the small dust grains, which are here within this blue and green color, they're still able to enter the gap and to reach the planet as well as the inner disk. So how can we now probe this with observations? So the first step, what we did was to obtain observations in the submillimeter continuum with ALMA to probe the large grain population. So here is how the PD70 disk looks like at about 855 micrometers. And you can see that the disk reveals as a large ring-like structure, which has quite some asymmetries, such as a brightness asymmetry here. And we also see the inner disk component. However, what is maybe most interesting is that if we plot the radial profile, we indeed see that the dust is really confined within a very narrow ring structure. So we were actually very curious about the substructures. So we just recently obtained new observations of the system with even higher angular resolution. And you can see that the inner edge of the dust ring is actually not quite as smooth, but it is actually decomposed of two ring components. So we have here a certain dip in the inner edge. This is very interesting because it could either mean that there might be another lower mass planet hidden within the disk, or it could also mean that the interaction of the two giant planets with the outer disk is actually much more complex. As a next step, we also looked at the gas. So we observed 12 CO in the submillimeter regime, again with ALMA. And this is actually very interesting because this now adds another dimension to the data, which is the dimension of the gas velocity. So just as a reminder, here on the upper left, you see how the disk looked like in the continuum. And so this is also denoted here by these white contours. And when we now go through all the channel maps along the frequency axis, you can see that we are probing different parts of the disk, which is just because the disk is in rotation around the star. So the gas at the different disk locations have different line of sight velocities. You can also see that the gas component actually reaches to quite large distances, much larger than the continuum ring, which is also a feature that is observed in many protoplanetary disks. So the first thing what we can do is now to really collapse these data and create a zeroth moment map. So here you can see that we very well detect the inner disk component, but also a bright outer disk here, which also has quite some substructures, such as a small gap and some azimuthal asymmetry, as you can see here, which I will not go into detail now. However, the most striking feature is that there is a very deep gap here in the inner region. You can very well see that when we trace the radial profile. And interestingly, this gap is almost perfectly co-located with the orbits of the two giant planets. So this is the first evidence that indeed these planets are carving a deep gap in the disk. And it also means that the planets must actually be quite massive to be able to actually do that. So this perturbation of the gas surface density by the planets will now also come along with the perturbation of the pressure profile. And this will, again, modify the rotational velocities of the gas. So the next step is now the question, can we actually establish a rotation profile? So trace the rotational velocity of the gas as a function of distance to the star. And can we actually really detect these perturbations in the kinematic structure of the disk as well? Before doing that, we actually have, however, to acknowledge that what we are actually seeing in our images for the gas is a 2D projection of the emission, which is actually coming from a 3-dimensional surface, because the gas is coming from an elevated surface layer above the midplane. So in order to be able to deproject the spectra, such that we really know on which pixel of the image the emission comes from which location within the disk, we have to put some constraints on this emission surface. So what we can do for that is to compute a so-called rotation map, which we can see here, which for each pixel computes the line of sight velocity of the gas. So we can see that this northern part of the disk is coming towards us, while this southern part is actually receding from us. And we can build up a model for the CO emission, which takes into account a certain parameterization so a certain shape, assumes a certain shape for the emission surface, but which leaves open as an open parameter the absolute scaling of the emission surface. And for these models, we can then compute these rotation maps, so how we would expect these rotation maps to look like for these models, and fit them to the observed rotation map. And for this, doing this, we can then get constraints on the absolute scaling, so on the height of the emission of the CO as a function of radius. And now, having these constraints, we can deproject the spectra and therefore create these radial profiles of the rotational velocity of the gas. So here on this upper plot on the right-hand side, you see the rotational velocity as a function of distance from the star. In the gray dashed line, you see what we would expect for a smooth disk, which does not see any perturbation, so which is basically in Keplerian rotation. And in blue, you see what which is actually measured. So there is quite some perturbation, and you can even better see this in the residuals in the lower plot. And this is now a very nice evidence that indeed there is quite some perturbation in the kinematic structure of the disk, which implies, again, modified pressure profile of the disk, which is due to the interaction with the two planets. So in the step before, I told you we have to assume a certain parameterization for the emission surface in order to be able to have some constraints on the absolute scaling. However, thanks to the fact that we have now observations at quite high angular and spectral resolution for the 12CO, we can actually now really start to directly measure this emission surface. And we are following here an approach that has been developed a few years ago, which basically consists of going through all the channel maps and analyzing the morphology of the emission of the gas in each of these channel maps, and using some geometrical considerations, it is then possible to translate that into the height of the emission surface as a function of radius. So this is now the result that we are getting with this method. And it's actually very consistent with what we expect for a disk in hydrostatic equilibrium, which is that the emission surface will just rise as a function of radius. However, which is what is very striking here, is that the emission surface in this inner region is extremely flat. And this coincides again with the region where the two planets PD70b and C are present. And this is again consistent with the picture that the planets are heavily depleting this inner region from gas, which will lead to a very low emission surface. And we can now even try to make a 3D projection of the surface. So here we have this inner region where the planets are located, and beyond their orbits, the emission surface is just rising. Okay, so now that we have done a very deep analysis of the protoplanetary disk, we can try to go one step further and actually look at the planets themselves. So models predict that the accretion of material onto the planets is mediated by a circumplanetary disk. So what is thought to be happening is that gas from the upper layers of the protoplanetary disk will fall down from the outer edges of the planet-induced gap onto the surface of the circumplanetary disk in vertical direction, where the material will shock, and then some of that material will be accreted onto the planet, and some of it will also be radially expelled, sustaining kind of a meridional circulation. So we know from these H-alpha observations that the planets are indeed in the process of accretion. So a logical consequence is just the question, can we actually detect this circumplanetary disk? So we searched for circumplanetary dust with ALMA observations in the dust continuum. And we were actually able to detect a compact source here at the location of PD70C. However, we could not be very sure yet that it was really just associated to the planet, because the signal was still kind of connected to the outer ring. We also detected a very faint emission close to the location of the other planet, PD70b. However, it turned out to be quite offset from the near-infrared location of the planet. So this was very puzzling. So we went back to the system now with ALMA observations at the same wavelength, however, at much higher angular resolution. And with these observations, we could indeed confirm this compact signal at the location of PD70C, and this time it was also really detached from the outer ring. we also redetected some emission close to the other planet. However, its morphology and also its nature is really uncertain and has to be probed by future observations. So we really interpret this detected emission at PD70C as circumplanetary dust. However, in order to really prove its disk structure, we will have to show or to detect Keplerian motion of the gas around it, which is not yet possible at with the current observations. But what we can do is to measure the flux of the signal and making some assumptions on the temperature of the dust and the dust opacities. It is possible to make some constraints on the evolved dust mass. And doing that, we find that the ratio of this dust mass to the planet mass is on the order of 10 to the minus 5, which is compared to models appears to be a quite low number, which could potentially mean that the planet is already coming to the end stages of its formation process. And with this, I'm also coming to the end of my presentation. So I hope I could convince you that multi-wavelength observations are very powerful to probe all these structures in protoplanetary disks in both gas and dust. And also, I hope I could convince you that PD70 is really an ideal test bed where we can probe various different processes of planet formations with observations. And yeah, this is a very fascinating system. It has already shown us that, at least in this case, it apparently was possible to assemble two giant planets and settle them near to mean motion resonance already in 5 million years. And we also got observational evidence that these planets are really opening a deep gap in their protoplanetary disk, leading to the trapping of large dust grains in the outer regions of the disk. And this is very interesting also when we come back to the solar system, because the formation of Jupiter might also have created such a gap in the protostellar disk, which could have had some impact on the evolution of the inner regions of the solar system. So I'm actually very curious about potential parallels to the formation of the solar system. So yeah, if anyone is interested to have a chat about that, please just drop me an email. And I think that in general, we can be very hopeful for the future in the sense that, I mean, this PD70 system is really fascinating. However, to really get a very broad observational view on these processes during planet formation, it would also be very important to actually detect much more of these systems. And yeah, hopefully future instruments such as the James Webb Space Telescope will help us to find more of these systems. And also the next generation of 30-meter ground-based telescopes will help us to better understand the inner regions of these disks. So yeah, I think we can be very hopeful and optimistic for the future. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Miriam, I wanted to thank you for an absolutely fascinating talk. Just very cool. Before I ask my questions, anybody else? Grace, go ahead, and then Megan.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam, for an absolutely fantastic talk. Unlike most of the planetary scientists at PSI, I'm actually an astronomer. I study the very early stages of star formation. And I was struck by your slide showing the expected infall onto the forming planet with the schematic. Could you go back to that for
Yes.
a minute with the circumplanetary disk
Here, yeah.
illustrated? Yeah, so I'm wondering, I mean, this is a more evolved system, but in the early stages, would you in principle at least be able to detect outflow or jets from
the planets?
From the planets, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And we were also already thinking about that, if that could maybe possible with ALMA detecting like some kinematic signature of that. So I haven't in mind, or I haven't seen any detailed model of really predicting that, if that would be really possible with the current instrumentation, but that is really something that would be interesting to look at. Yes.
Yeah, I'd be interested in thinking about that further as well.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, very interesting.
Megan. Megan?
Oh, sorry, that was just applause. Great talk.
Thank you.
Okay. Mary, my question is, I just wonder, to what extent is the circumstellar disk that is observed with in terms of what is observed that has the planets embedded in it, accounts for the mass of that has been accreted into the planets, or whether there is an unobserved, much larger particle size population that is the primary source of the mass for the accreted planets.
So I don't have now by heart current estimates of the mass on the protoplanetary disk itself. So you mean how much potential there would be left in order to form any other planets in the system?
Well, if you were to look at a mass versus radius of the disk that of the system that we're looking at here, and then you see where the planets have formed, it's like in our own solar systems, Stu Weidenschilling back in the 70s or sometime did that kind of a plot and gets this divot around the asteroid belt that showed about an Earth mass of stuff was tossed out, but otherwise there's kind of a smooth continuum there.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you're doing the same thing here based on just the mass that is manifested in the images here from the gas and the tens of microns to whatever millimeter sized particles that are providing radiation that's being observed. Are we looking at the source material that's sufficient to form these planets, or is there a larger mass of yet larger particles that are not imaged here that is where the most of that's coming from to form these planets?
Okay. So what we can image with our continuum observations, that are usually dust grains which are on the size of a few hundred micrometers to millimeter in size. On the mass reservoir for particles which are, I don't know, meter or kilometer size, I think we do not have any constraints.
Well, like with Jupiter, Jupiter and Saturn, they're mostly gas, right? That's where most of the mass comes from. And if these planets are like Jupiter and Saturn, and so they're mostly, the mass is mostly from gas, then you're imaging the gas. And so you should be able to say that, yeah, there's enough garbage here that it's accreted this much of it from this region, and then that's consistent with the how much gas is available at a lower level, of course, further out or closer into the star or whatever. So that I was just trying to get a sense of to what extent are we looking at processes that are indicate aspects of the planet formation process, or are we actually looking at the material that's really building these things?
Yeah, so I guess I mean these gas giants are really composed to the largest amount of their mass by the gas that they are created from the surrounding disk. I mean, from now it looks like that they probably have already accreted, I don't know, maybe 90% of their mass, so they are already probably coming to the end of their accretion process, which also is connected to the fact that they are quite deep in their gaps. So the question is how much of the gas can actually be refilled to even let the planets grow to even larger sizes. But yeah, I guess that the material that we see, for example, in the CO observations or generally in gas observations, that's really that material that will primarily build up these planets.
Jean-Philippe?
Yeah, hello, Miriam.
No.
Thank you for this talk. It's very nice. I have a question about the atmospheric properties. Could you please show us again the spectra, the near-infrared spectra?
Yes. It's very slow.
I'm intrigued by. I'm not very familiar with this this kind of spectra, so.
Does it still move for you? Because my picture is now frozen.
It moves. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry, I think it's very slow. Wait, sorry, I will try to do it this way.
There you go, yeah.
It loads very slowly, I'm sorry. Okay, should be. Here, okay.
Oh, yes. Yeah, so, oh, it's, okay.
Yeah.
So this is, what is the unit in the vertical axis?
So this is the flux versus the wavelength, and so we can here see the spectrum taken with the sphere instrument, and in these colorful points we can see the photometry from other instruments, and we compared this to the outputs of these atmospheric models, and we could actually see that the model that does not contain clouds, they are not very well to reproduce the spectral energy distribution. In particular, we have here some molecular features that we actually not observe in the observations. So in general, we found that the spectral energy is actually, energy distribution is very flat and very featureless. And this is in general indicating that we're actually not looking very deep into the atmosphere.
Okay, and from a technical point of view, this is the flux. Is it light scattered by the atmosphere of these planets, or is it light emitted by the atmosphere?
It should be emitted by the atmosphere, yes.
Oh, okay, it's emission spectrum. Okay.
Yeah.
Does this have a thermal component removed, or does that include the thermal component?
It includes the thermal component.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nalan.
Yeah, excellent talk, Miriam. Actually, I have 3 questions, but 2 are very short. Do you have fairly accurate masses of the planets, and what are the orbital periods? Are they in resonance? And
Yes.
the third question is there any evidence of migration of these planets, and the location of the dust ring has anything to do with migration?
Okay, so to your first question regarding the mass, so we do have some constraints, however, they're still quite uncertain. So usually the constraints for PD7TB, so the more inner planet, range, I think between maybe about like 5 to 10 Jupiter masses, while as the masses for the other planet are slightly lower. So it seems that the outer planet, PD-70C, is less massive than PD-70B. So 2 to 5 Jupiter masses or so. But indeed, these masses are still taken with some caution, so they're not extremely tight constraints yet on that. For the orbital periods, so they are found to be close to the 2-to-1 mean motion resonance. And the hydrodynamical simulations of the system show that they should be able to settle. So they reproduce also this behavior that they would be able to settle into mean motion resonance very quickly after their formation. The third question was regarding the migration. So the simulations show that these 2 planets do migrate in outwards direction. It's a good question. Now, I'm not sure if we can actually probe that now with observations. At least I would know now how to prove that the migration history with observations of this system. But at least the simulations predict that they would migrate in outwards direction.
Outward, you say?
Yes.
Okay.
Outward.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Miriam? Miriam, thank you very much. And I'll be telling everybody to watch the video of this, and we'll be posting it on our YouTube site. And but really interesting stuff, and I'm amazed at the high resolution, data that's obtainable, these days.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to present you the work, and thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you.